I knew I was in for a fight the second I saw the envelope taped to my door. The paper was printed on stiff, pretentious cardstock, the HOA logo embossed in raised gold foil like a damn wedding invitation. Notice of violation, it read in bold, capitalized letters. Fine, $250. Reason, trash bin left on curb past 6 a.m. I checked my watch. It was 6:07. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. I'd only just moved into Oak Crest Estates a week ago, still getting used to the neighborhood. The place looked like something out of a postcard. White picket fences, manicured lawns, American flags hanging from porches. The kind of place where kids still rode their bikes in cul-de-sacs and old men drank coffee on their driveways. But there was something else, too. A stiffness in the air, a tension I hadn't quite put my finger on. Now I had a name for it. Deborah Whitmore. She was waiting for me. I spotted her across the street, standing like a vulture in front of her beige McMansion, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line of self-righteous satisfaction. Mid-50s, blonde bob cut so stiff, it probably whistled in the wind, a beige pantsuit that matched the color of her house. Even her smile, when she finally gave me one, was beige. I walked toward her, holding up the fine. "This some kind of joke?" she gasped, hand fluttering, to her chest, like I'd just thrown a brick through her window. "Excuse me?" "The trash bin. 7 minutes late." I waved the letter. "Do you time it with a stopwatch or just sit at the window all morning waiting for an excuse to write someone up?" Her face pinched tight. "The rules exist for a reason, Mr. Calloway." I hadn't told her my name. Her eyes flicked to my truck, a dark blue Chevy Tahoe parked neatly in my driveway. She must have already run my plates. "I assure you, all homeowners are expected to comply." And I assure. "You," I said, "this is ridiculous." She gave me a syrupy smile, the kind Southerners use before they insult you. "That's what the appeals process is for." Then, as if the matter was settled, she turned and strutted away, clipboard in hand. I should have let it go. I should have chalked it up to petty HOA nonsense and forgotten about it. But when I got back inside, I found another letter tucked under my doormat. Second violation. Fine, $500. Reason, unauthorized vehicle in driveway. I felt my pulse spike. I glanced outside at my truck, sitting where it had been for days, not blocking the sidewalk, not breaking a single rule in the community guidelines. This was personal. I walked back outside, jaw clenched, but Deborah was already gone. She wanted a fight. Fine. She had no idea who she was messing with. The fines kept coming. $100 for a lawn ornament that clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. A small stone eagle I found at Home Depot. $50 for excessive noise. I had played my TV too loud at 7 p.m. $100 for non-standard holiday decorations, a single wreath on my door 2 weeks before Christmas. Each one came with the same condescending letter, the same implication. "You don't belong here." I started paying attention. I noticed how she only targeted certain people, first responders, veterans, young families who couldn't push back. I saw how she used rules as weapons, stacking fines until people either conformed or left. And then I found something worse. One morning I watched as a tow truck rumbled into the neighborhood. Whitmore and Sons Towing was plastered on the side in gaudy red lettering. 2 men hopped out, both wearing navy polos that almost looked like police uniforms, except real cops don't have HOA enforcement stitched on their sleeves. They hooked up an old Ford pickup in one of the driveways. The owner, an elderly firefighter named Hank, stumbled outside in his robe pleading with them. He had parked half an inch over the curb, half an inch. They towed it anyway. Later, I found out he had to pay over $700 to get it back. That's when I started digging. I went to the city clerk's office, pulled records on Whitmore and Sons Towing. What I found made my blood run cold. The company wasn't just an HOA contractor, it was owned by Deborah's brother. They've been running a racket for years, targeting certain residents, slapping them with HOA fines, then sending the family business to tow their cars under the pretense of enforcement. Residents would be forced to pay ridiculous fees, and Deborah's family raked in the cash. No oversight, no accountability. It was a shakedown, and it had been going on for years. I closed the file, gripping the edges so hard my knuckles turned white. I'd seen corruption before. But this was something else. She thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. The next day, I showed up at the HOA office. Deborah was at her desk, typing on a laptop. She barely glanced up. "If you're here to dispute another fine, the appeals process is clearly outlined in the—" I dropped the file on her desk. She blinked. Slowly, she reached for it, flipping through the pages. Her face darkened. "Where did you get this?" "Public records." I leaned in, voice low. "You've been running a scam, targeting first responders, veterans, working families, using your brother's company to shake them down. It ends now." Her nostrils flared. "You don't have the authority to—" I pulled out my badge, her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "I'll be at the HOA meeting next week," I said. "And I'm bringing everyone you've screwed over. Hope you're ready." I turned and walked out, leaving her sitting there, pale and silent. For the first time, she looked afraid. And that was just the beginning. I left the HOA office, with the satisfaction of knowing I'd rattled her, but I wasn't naive. Deborah Whitmore wasn't the type to back down. I'd spent enough time around power-hungry bureaucrats to know that fear didn't make them surrender. It made them dangerous. Sure enough, the retaliation started within 24 hours. The first strike came in the form of a cease and desist letter taped to my front door. "Mr. Calloway, your repeated harassment and unlawful investigation into the operations of Oak Crest Estates Homeowners Association and its affiliates are in violation of community standards. Further actions may result in legal consequences, including but not limited to fines, liens, or civil litigation. Translation: drop it or we'll bury you." I laughed, ripped the letter in half, and went inside. The next day, she escalated. I woke up to the sound of a tow truck idling outside my house. I threw on a shirt, stepped onto my porch, and there they were. Two of Deborah's hired goons trying to tow my truck. One of them had the nerve to wear a fake badge clipped to his belt, as if he was actual law enforcement. I marched down the driveway. "Touch that hitch and I'll have you in cuffs before you can blink." The guy turned, already smirking, but the second he saw the real badge on my belt, his face paled. We got a work order," the driver stammered. "HOA says this vehicle is legally parked in my driveway," I cut in, "and you're committing fraud by impersonating law enforcement." I took out my phone, snapped a picture of their fake badges, then zoomed in on the Whitmore and Sons towing logo on the side of their truck. "Tell Deborah I'm just getting started." They left in a hurry, but the real message came that night. I was sitting in my living room, sifting through more of the HOA's financials, when my security cameras sent a notification to my phone. Motion detected. I opened the feed, and there she was, Deborah Whitmore, standing at the end of my driveway. She wasn't alone. Two men, not the usual tow truck guys, stood beside her, both wearing dark clothing. I stepped outside, arms crossed. "Something I can help you with?" Deborah took a slow step forward, lips curling into a smirk. "This is a nice house, Mr. Calloway." Her voice was smooth, practiced. Shame if it became difficult to keep. I felt the shift then, the unspoken threat. "You're awfully invested in keeping me quiet," I said. "Almost like you've got something to hide." The two men flanking her didn't move, didn't blink, just muscle, standing in the shadows, waiting. Deborah tilted her head. "Some rules matter more than others, Mr. Calloway." I met her gaze, unflinching. "And some people think they're untouchable, until they're not." A slow smile spread across her lips. "We'll see." And just like that, she turned and walked away, her two shadows following. I stayed on my porch, watching them disappear. Into the night, a cold certainty settling in my gut. This wasn't just about HOA fines anymore. This was war. The next week was hell. A new violation notice appeared every morning. My mailbox was suddenly too tall. My porch light was non-compliant. I was fined for unauthorized alterations to landscaping because I dared to plant a flower bed. I didn't pay a cent, and I wasn't the only one. Word was spreading. Neighbors started knocking on my door, sharing their own stories. A single mom fined for leaving a bike on her porch. An elderly couple threatened with eviction over a bird feeder. A firefighter fined for parking his department-issued truck in his own driveway. Deborah had been running this scam for years, tightening her grip with every new rule, every fake fine, every backroom deal. And the worst part? She had the power to do it. HOAs had insane authority in some states. She could legally place liens on homes, force people to sell their property, even auction off homes to cover unpaid fines. And that's exactly what she'd done. At least 4 families had lost their homes, not because they broke the law, because they crossed her. That was the last straw. It was time to hit back. I spent the next week gathering evidence. I had records, testimonies, a pattern of corruption going back years. But it wasn't enough. If I wanted to end this, I needed something bigger. Something that would destroy her credibility, something she couldn't recover from. And then, just when I thought I'd hit a wall, I got lucky. Or rather, she got sloppy. It was a bank statement. One of Deborah's former HOA board members, a man she'd forced out years ago, handed it over with shaking hands. It showed direct transfers from HOA accounts to Whitmore and Sons Towing. Thousands funneled into personal accounts, unapproved expenses, fake invoices, proof of embezzlement. And the best part? It was signed by Deborah. That was my kill shot, but I needed one final push. So I set the bait. I walked right into her office, placed a single copy of the statement on her desk, and watched the blood drain from her face. She snatched it up, eyes scanning the numbers, her fingers trembling. "Where did you get this?" she hissed. I shrugged. "Public records." She knew she was caught. She also knew the only way out was to destroy the evidence before I could use it. And just as I'd hoped, she took the bait. That night, I got an alert from my security system. Motion detected. I checked the cameras and there she was. Deborah herself, sneaking into my backyard, breaking into my garage, looking for the originals. I smiled because what she didn't know, I had already sent copies to every homeowner in the neighborhood, and tomorrow I was going to drop the hammer. I barely slept that night. I didn't need to. The adrenaline was enough to keep me wired, pacing. My living room, watching the security feeds, waiting for the fallout to begin. It didn't take long. By 7 a.m., my phone was buzzing. First it was Hank, the retired firefighter. "You sent this to my wife?" His voice was low, like he couldn't quite believe what he was holding. "Sent it to everyone," I said. He let out a long whistle. "Holy hell, Calloway. She's been bleeding us dry." Then came Lisa, the single mom they'd fined into near bankruptcy. Then an elderly couple I hadn't even met yet. Then a guy named Ray, who had nearly lost his house last year over unpaid fees that, according to the documents I sent, had never been owed in the first place. The whole neighborhood was waking up, and they were pissed. By 10 a.m., the HOA's official email server crashed from the flood of complaints. By 11:30, a group of neighbors showed up at my house, ready for war. "We're not letting her get away with this," Lisa said, arms crossed. "We've been letting her bully us for years, and it's stopping today." Hank nodded. "She's got the next HOA meeting at 5. We're all showing up." I grinned. Good. Because I had one last move to make before the meeting, and it involved Deborah's biggest mistake yet. At 3 p.m., I pulled up in front of the HOA office, locked the Tahoe, and walked inside like I owned the place. Deborah was there, standing behind her desk, her usual smug composure fractured. Papers were scattered across the surface as if she'd been rifling through them all day, looking for a way out. She looked up when I stepped inside, and for the first time since I'd met her, she wasn't smiling. "You son of a—" "Go ahead," I said. "Finish that sentence. Would love to see how professional it sounds in court." Her nostrils flared. "You have no authority here." "Oh, see, that's where you're wrong." I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen and turned it to face her. The footage was crisp, high definition. It showed her sneaking into my garage last night, breaking and entering, her face drained of color. "You set me up," she whispered. I shrugged. "You played yourself." Her jaw clenched, but she forced a calm breath, smoothing the front of her blazer. "It doesn't matter. None of this matters. You can't prove anything." I slid another file onto her desk. Bank transfers, falsified records, evidence of money, laundering between the HOA and Whitmore and Sons Towing. "See," I said, "I don't need to prove anything." I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Because the entire neighborhood already knows." I saw the moment it hit her, the way her pupils constricted, the way her fingers curled against the desk. "You think you've won?" She sneered. "You think this little tantrum is going to change anything?" "Oh, I know it is," I smirked, "because you're not going to be the one running that meeting tonight." "I am." Her mask cracked, just for a second. Then, just like that, the mask snapped back on. She straightened her spine, tilting her chin up. "We'll see about that." And I swear for a moment I saw something else in her eyes. Not fear, something worse, desperation. She had something planned, and I'd just put myself right in her crosshairs. By 4:30 the community center was packed. It wasn't the only one who had been busy. Word had spread like wildfire. People who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years were there, armed with the files I'd sent them, whispering among themselves. And at the center of it all, Deborah, sitting at the front of the room, looking completely unbothered. That was my first red flag. She should have been sweating bullets. Instead, she was leaning back in her chair, lips curled into a smirk, flipping through the stack of papers. In front of her, like she had all the time in the world. I took a seat near the front. Lisa sat next to me. "Something's wrong," she muttered. I nodded. "Yeah. She's too calm." At 5:00 sharp, she stood, clapped her hands together and smiled. "Good evening, everyone. What a fantastic turnout tonight." Murmurs rippled through the room. People weren't here for pleasantries. She knew it and she loved it. "I understand there's been some concern about recent HOA policies," she continued, tone syrupy sweet. "A lot of misinformation has been spread about our finances. And I just want to take this opportunity to clarify a few things." She turned, plucked a manila envelope from the table and held it up. My stomach dropped. "This," she announced, "is an official lawsuit." Silence. Then low murmurs. She smiled wider. "It names several individuals who have engaged in harassment, defamation, and the unlawful spread of false financial documents, all of which have damaged the integrity of this community." She paused, letting the words sink in. Then she turned and looked directly at me. "Including you, Mr. Calloway." Gasps. Lisa grabbed my arm. "She's bluffing." I wasn't so sure. She handed the envelope to one of her cronies at the front. A desk, then turned back to the room, hands clasped in front of her like a benevolent queen. "We must protect our community from slander," she continued smoothly. "I will not allow outside agitators to disrupt the harmony of Oak Crest Estates." People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Some of them had come ready for blood. Now, suddenly, the conversation had shifted. She'd just turned the tables. It was a brilliant move. Legal threats always worked. People panicked at the mere mention of a lawsuit. She'd managed to stall my momentum before I even had a chance to present my case. Lisa leaned closer. "What do we do?" I kept my eyes on Deborah, watching the way she smiled, watching the way she held herself, soaking in the power, she thought. She had just reclaimed. Then it hit me. The one thing I hadn't considered. She had a backup plan, and it wasn't just a bluff. She'd been planning this from the start. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "She made a mistake," I murmured. Lisa frowned. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair. She just tied herself to all of it. Lisa blinked. Then, slowly, understanding dawned on her face. We weren't the ones in trouble. She was. Because if she had formally attached her name to this, then she had just given me exactly what I needed, a direct paper trail and a way to destroy her for good. I smiled, and for the first time all night, Deborah looked nervous. She knew it too. The flicker of doubt crossed her face for just a second before she smoothed it over with her usual saccharine confidence. She thought she'd won, thought she'd outplayed me, outmaneuvered the neighborhood and locked in her power for good, but she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had put her name on everything. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the polished floor. All eyes turned toward me. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of what was about to happen settle over the room. Then I cleared my throat. "Well, that's interesting," I said. Deborah tilted her head. "I beg your pardon." I gestured toward the stack of legal papers she had so dramatically unveiled. "This lawsuit of yours, did you say it was official?" Her eyes flickered, but she nodded. "Of course." I crossed my arms. "Filed with the county?" "Of course," she repeated, but her voice was tighter now. "Great." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, because that means it's public record. I turned, looking at the crowd. "And as of 5 minutes ago, so are the financial records she's been hiding." A murmur rippled through the audience. I had hit send the moment she'd dropped that envelope, pushing out everything, the bank transfers, the fraudulent invoices, the direct evidence of her siphoning HOA funds to her family's business, straight to the county fraud department, the state attorney general, and every single homeowner's inbox. She had walked straight into her own trap. The blood drained from her face. "That's a serious crime." "Deborah," I continued, enjoying every second of watching her unravel. "Misusing HOA funds, embezzlement, and now this lawsuit, tying yourself directly to the financial decisions in question. That's fraud." The murmurs turned into outright shouting. "Is this true?" Hank demanded, waving his phone. "This says she's been stealing from us for years." "I paid thousands in fines," Lisa snapped. "For what? So you could pocket it?" Deborah opened her mouth, but I cut her off. "And let's not forget the illegal towing scam," I said, pacing now. "Whitmore and Sons, her brother's company, illegally posing as law enforcement, unlawful seizures of private property. That's a felony." She tried to recover, raising her hands, forcing a weak smile. Now, let's not be rash." "You shut your damn mouth," someone shouted from the back. Deborah actually flinched. I could see it, the moment she realized she had lost control. I turned back to her, stepping in close, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You really should have done your research," I murmured, "because you just tried to sue the chief of police." Her breath hitched. The color drained from her face completely, replaced by something raw and ugly. Panic. I straightened. "You want to talk lawsuits, Deborah?" I said loudly. "Great, because I've just sent a criminal referral to the state attorney general's office." A genuine gasp rippled through the crowd, and then, like wolves smelling blood, they turned on her. The room erupted. People surged forward, shouting, waving documents, demanding answers. Deborah shrank back, eyes darting to her board members for support, but one by one they inched away like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Hank was the first to throw down the gauntlet. "I motion to remove Deborah Whitmore as HOA president." Lisa shot to her feet. "I second!" Someone else called, "Vote, right now!" Deborah whirled to her last remaining loyalists, but it was too late. No one was coming to her defense. She tried one last move. "You can't do this," she snapped. "You don't have the authority." "The hell we don't," Ray spat. "You used us. You stole from us. You threatened my family," Lisa seethed. "You towed my damn truck," Hank roared. The meeting was spiraling out of control. Deborah knew it. She grabbed her papers, clutching them like a lifeline, but her hands were shaking. I stepped forward, looking her dead in the eye. "You've lost." She knew it. And that was when the doors burst open and two uniformed officers stepped inside. The room fell silent. A uniformed officer scanned the room, then turned his eyes on Deborah. "Mrs. Whitmore," her hands clenched around her useless stack of papers. This is outrageous. I've done nothing wrong." The officer stepped forward, producing a folded sheet of paper. "Deborah Whitmore, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement and conspiracy to commit unlawful seizures of property." A chorus of gasps, her face twisted. "This is a mistake. The officer grabbed her wrist, smoothly twisting her arms behind her back as the cuffs clicked shut. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked. I folded my arms. "You're not untouchable, Deborah." And for the first time, she realized it. As she was dragged out of the room, screaming threats, begging for someone to help her, I turned back to the crowd. The anger that had once been directed at her was now shifting, not into chaos, into something else. Relief. For the first time, they weren't afraid. They were free, and just like that, the reign of Deborah Whitmore was over. The next HOA meeting was a little different. For starters, it was held outside, on the community lawn, under string lights and open air. No board members, on a raised dais, no threats, no fines. Just neighbors, talking, laughing, rebuilding. A new HOA board was elected, this time with people who actually lived in the community. Deborah's house, sold, her assets, seized. Turns out, when you spend years siphoning money from a community, the law doesn't look kindly on you and me. I stepped down from the HOA entirely, not because I wasn't invested, because I knew they didn't need me anymore. This wasn't my fight to win, it was theirs. And as I sat back, watching the neighborhood take its first breath of real freedom, I smiled, because in the end, the tyrant fell and the people rose.